Hello, my name is Russell Swanson, and this is the 13th lecture in a 20-part lecture series on the history of ethics. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume, who was born in 1711 and died in 1776, and has a couple of works that I'd like to pull some ideas from and develop them for you. His early work in 1738 called A Treatise of Human Nature, and then his probably more important work, later work, An Inquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals from 1751, which was, I think, also redone and republished in 1777. Hume, just a little bit about him, very well-loved figure, not a popular thinker or philosopher during his lifetime, never, I think, succeeded in landing a job within academia as a professor, but certainly over time, people have come to see Hume as an incredible thinker who argues very, very effectively for his positions. Particularly, he's famous for arguing against the dominant positions of the 18th century. He's got a nickname in modern philosophy. He's called the Wrecking Ball. And that's a testament, again, to the fact that he tends to take a position against the dominant positions of the day. And he does so in a way that's incredibly effective. And I'll try to develop that a little bit for you in the context of our lecture series on the history of ethics. And so, let me set the stage for Hume's work in the 18th century. He's coming into a time period in which a number of thinkers are realizing that there is a tension between the view of reality that is being generated by the modern sciences and our ideas of morality historically, which have tended to be grounded, particularly in the roughly 1,000 years of the medieval era, were grounded in something like divine command theory or something like a natural law theory of morality. And so, early thinkers like Hobbes, and about 100 years prior to David Hume doing his work, tried to argue that the source of morality is not something external to human beings, not some unprovable divine source, not in terms of commands, not in terms of a created natural moral order that then we have the ability to observe. For somebody like Hobbes, right, you may recall from my earlier lecture, human beings use their capacity for thinking to think their way out of the difficult an unpleasant situation, unsafe situation of the state of nature. And morality is sort of part of the solution to how do we think our way out of that box. And so the debate that's emerging in the 18th century is one of how do humans generate our understanding of morality? And how can we describe that in a way that is persuasive and convincing and perhaps offers us a way to more objectively debate our moral judgments with one another if we abandon in the modern age, because of the modern crisis, claims that morality comes from the commands of God or a God-given natural moral order. The debate in the modern era is going to be whether humans think their way to morality or whether they feel their way to morality. These are two of the dominant positions within the modern debate about the origins of morality itself and sort of what's behind our individual moral judgments that we make. And so there's this dichotomy that's set up here in this debate. It's either reason or it's sentiment that is the cause and the origin place of morality and moral judgment. It's either the head or the heart, to speak a little bit more metaphorically. And like I have already suggested, many of the moderns will say it is the head, it is reasoning, it is thinking that allows us to generate a human but yet objective perspective on morality. And Hume, the wrecking ball, is going to take his position against the one that will be more common, I think that you could say that the social contractarians are arguing that reason is behind morality. Certainly we'll see the really important 18th century, late 18th century figure of Immanuel Kant responding to David Hume and arguing, maybe stronger than anyone has ever argued the case, that reason is the foundation for morality and moral judgments, or should be, if we're going to do morality well and we're going to make moral judgments well. So Hume's going to take a position against what's going to become the dominant position of the modern age, the dominant position being that morality is grounded in reason. So Hume's going to say, no, it's grounded in sentiment. It's grounded in feelings. It's grounded in the heart. And this is going to produce the position that we're going to call Humean, just to use Hume's name as an adjective, Humean subjectivism. And let's talk about that term just for a second. Ethical subjectivism generally is the position that morality is grounded in feelings and that moral judgments are reports of feelings. Okay, now as soon as I say that, right, that subjectivism claims that moral judgments are grounded in feelings, many 21st century listeners will say, oh yeah, that sounds about right, and everybody's got their own feelings, and that's why everybody's got their own different opinions. And now where this is going to go, if you can see it, is it's going to go into a form of subjectivism that's often referred to as simple subjectivism, which is actually a form of ethical relativism, right? The idea that moral judgments are merely relative to a certain perspective, in this case, an individual's feelings. We're going to deal with that a little bit more systematically in my next lecture, so I'll set that aside. But here I just wanted to emphasize that Hume's version of subjectivism is not so simple. Sometimes I title this lecture Hume's Not So Simple Subjectivism, because the point that I want to underline and then I'll develop it for you, is that Hume is a subjectivist. He's the wrecking ball. He's going against the dominant position of the modern era by saying it's not reason that is underlying morality, it's sentiment. But yet Hume is a modern thinker who, like many of the modern thinkers, are trying to avoid collapsing into relativism by giving us an account of morality and ethics and moral judgments that can differentiate between better and worse moral judgments. And that's going to be key. So try to understand in this lecture the way in which Humean subjectivism seeks to give you a modern account of morality consistent with the metaphysics brought to you by science, the picture of reality brought to you by science. It's post-modern crisis. Hume is very much responding to the modern crisis. And yet at the same time, Hume is trying to avoid relativism. My suspicion is that he, like many of us, just would regard relativism as tempting, but just not helpful. It's just not a useful, practically valuable idea of morality. It maybe explains a lot of what we see in the world, but then it gives up on the possibility of constructive moral debate in a way that is not useful. And Hume in the 18th century, right, is in some ways rejecting what the social contract theory is doing, developing out of Hobbes' work, Leviathan, because Hume, in some sense, I think, just doesn't buy that we can really persuasively explain, as strong as social contract theory is, as many advantages as the theory has, I think Hume would deny that it is persuasive. Particularly, I'll use this example. If we look at some of cases of what we would consider moral actions, and really maybe more admirable moral actions, great acts of sort of self-sacrifice. Think of somebody like Harriet Tubman, sneaking back into places in the United States that still had legalized, racialized slavery. What she did, right, is heroic. The social contractarian would say, well, that's supererogatory. It's above and beyond the call of moral duty. But Hume would say, look, you just can't explain the actions of somebody like a Harriet Tubman effectively by saying that morality is some kind of social construction that's ultimately tied back to enlightened or long-term self-interest. That what would make more sense is if we could explain how something that is very natural within human beings, in some of us, gets developed and triggered and causes these actions that lead to, risking our lives for the well-being of people that we don't even know personally and that we're not related to genetically. And so Hume's going to embrace subjectivism, but then to explain that, right, to explain the sort of amazing expressions of moral behavior that we see in the world in a way that he thinks is more persuasive than a social contract approach. And yet at the same time, he's got this kind of balancing act. And this is some of the magic of Hume, is to cultivate this position that morality is based on a capacity to feel, but avoid what seems like the inevitable conclusion. And that is that if we ground morality in how we feel, that we're going to end up with equally valid moral perspectives that are just in direct contradiction to one another, i.e. we're going to end up in a form of ethical relativism. So I'll try to develop this for you now over the next little while. And I want to start off by giving you a sense for the argumentative strategy that Hume employs. I've already implied a little bit about that. Let me develop that a little bit more clearly. Hume is going to take on the modern debate, and he's going to say, basically, look, if morality isn't coming to us through the commands of God, and if morality isn't coming to us through some God-given natural teleological order, then it's somehow coming from humans. And if it's coming from humans, it seems to be coming from either our capacity for thought or our capacity for feeling, what we'll call reason versus sentiment. And so here are the options of how humans construct morality. Now, maybe you want to call that a false dichotomy. Let's set that aside for a moment. Let's assume this is right and proceed then to try to understand Hume's argumentative strategy here. It's either reason and thinking is the source of morality, or feeling, or what Hume calls sentiments, to use the 18th century term, sentiments that are the basis for morality. Let me, Hume would say, tell you why it's A or it's B. It's not A, therefore it must be B. Right? This is called the disjunctive syllogism. He basically says, here's two options. I'm going to tell you why it's not this option. So it's going to sound more convincing that it is the second option. It's reason or it's sentiment. Let me tell you why it's not reason. Therefore, it must be sentiment. And in his work, particularly in Inquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals, which, by the way, is funny, it's a part of a kind of an 18th and 19th century trend of calling books sort of exactly what they are. Think back to Hobbes and Leviathan. Hobbes, at least that's got kind of a little bit of literary flair to it, that title, not this one. An Inquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals, exactly, what it is. But in this work, he's going to develop two very famous arguments against reason, and more specifically, and listen carefully to this idea, against reason alone being central to the formation of our moral judgments, against reason by itself being central in terms of the origins of the construction of morality from human beings. And there'll be two arguments here. One that I think of as kind of more indirect, a little bit more difficult argument. And then the second argument a little bit more famous, I think a little bit more persuasive because it's a little bit more direct and really just sort of speaks right to the modern crisis in a way that's uniquely Humean. Okay, let's deal with the first argument from the inquiry, which basically is an argument that revolves around the idea of what motivates us to act. So Hume is exploring our motivation to act, and he's going to claim that reason by itself, reason alone, cannot motivate us, does not and cannot motivate us to take action. Okay, again, this is a kind of a difficult argument in part because it's a little bit indirect. What's the connection here to ethics? Okay, it sounds like we're talking about thinking and in relation to acting, but what's going to be the connection to ethics? Here's basically the structure of the argument. Reason by itself doesn't motivate us to act. Sentiments can and do motivate us to act. And then the third element, and here's how we tie in morality, moral judgments motivate us to act as well. Okay, now it's not meant to sound convincing yet because I haven't really given you the argument, but I'm giving you the argument structure here. Reason by itself does not motivate us to act. Sentiments do motivate us to act, and moral judgments motivate us to act. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to argue for kind of each element of this sort of these three premises here. And where this is going is that if we can convince ourselves, we'll see, that reason doesn't motivate us to act, if we can convince ourselves that sentiments do motivate us to act, and if we can convince ourselves that moral judgments motivate us to act, we've got a reason to believe that sentiments and moral judgments are more closely and intimately related than reason and thinking, because the reason and thinking is not as closely related to moral judgments because reason doesn't motivate us to act and moral judgments do, and sentiments do. So sentiments and moral judgments are more closely related than reason and moral judgments. Okay, let's try to develop a little bit of an understanding for each claim. I think in some sense, Hume maybe asserts this more than anything, that moral judgments cause us to motivate act. Let me help a little bit with that. You know, charitably, maybe what he's saying is if you really want to know what somebody believes morally, then don't listen to what they say, look at what they do. If you really believe that a certain action is wrong in your heart of hearts, and I hope I'm not sort of sneaking in, you know, my conclusion here with that phrase, I'm trying to make this sound persuasive. I don't necessarily want to be fallacious or illogical here, but if you really believe deep down that something like lying or stealing or killing is wrong, then you are going to be strongly motivated to avoid lying or stealing or killing. Okay, so I think, you know, at some level, that's the the simple claim. Moral judgments by themselves don't motivate us to act. And then Hume claims that sentiments do motivate us to act, but reason alone doesn't. Let me share with you a kind of a famous quote about this from an inquiry concerning the principles of morals in the 1751 version. Hume writes, "Ask a man why he uses exercise." By the way, let's just call it out here. Right here, every 18th century, people are still talking about men as if they're talking about everybody. Okay, a little patriarchy there. Okay, maybe we can let's be a little charitable to Hume, because I think Hume was a really admirable and apparently really kind person. So let's help him out here. Ask a person why he or she uses exercise. I'll paraphrase there. And he or she will answer, because, I'm going to go to the plural, because they desire to keep their health. Okay, so ask a person why they use exercise, and they will answer, because they desire to keep their health. If you then inquire why they desire health, they will readily reply, because sickness is painful. If you push your inquiries farther and desire a reason why they hate pain, it is impossible they can ever give any. This is an ultimate end and is never referred to any other object. Okay, in that complex, you know, pair of sentences, Hume is basically trying to argue that if you dig in on human motivation, what you're always going to find deep down is a sentiment. Now, Hume's going to use some very fancy language here. Sentiments already sounds fancy to us. Sentiments of approbation and sentiments of disapprobation. Sentiments of approval, sentiments of disapproval. I like to sometimes, you know, kind of half jokingly refer to this as likey and no likey. You know, that basically when you dig into human motivation, if you dig deeply enough, what you will find is there will be a feeling of likey versus no likey. And if you ask somebody why they engage in exercise and you dig deeply enough, you know, you're going to find a no likey. They no likey the pain of ill health. Okay, again, let's flesh this out a little bit. If you ask somebody why they exercise, they might think, and many of us probably might even think this right now, that actually we've reasoned our way to exercising, because certainly, you know, many days it doesn't feel good to get up and go push your body to this sort of uncomfortable yet healthy, let's hope, edge in order to get some good exercise. You know, but you might say, but I am using my thinking, my reasoning capacity. Be careful of the word reason here, not just like a reason as a cause for something, reason in the sense of our thinking capacity, our ability to manipulate symbols and engage in logic. That's the reason that we're talking about here, our reasoning capacity, right? And you might think that you have reasoned your way to exercise. You know, you might say, I don't even want to exercise, right? It hurts, so I don't want to exercise. I don't like it. I've thought my way to it. And Hume says, well, wait, let's push a little deeper. Let's scratch the surface here. You know, why have you decided based on reasoning and thinking that it would be good to exercise? What does exercise give you? You say, well, over the long run, I have thought and, you know, enough about this to realize that you know, regular exercise is tied to, you know, being healthy. And then Hume says, okay, interesting. Why do you want to be healthy? And this is where he's almost got you, right? He says, digging deeper, he said, well, you say, well, I would rather feel healthy. It's rational to want to feel, well, now what you're doing is kind of trying to hide in reasoning and thinking. And Hume says, look, just admit it. You like the way it feels to be healthy. There's no shame in that. And you don't like the way it feels to be unhealthy. Now, reason is involved here, but you're mistaken in thinking that reason is the motivation for the action. Reason is involved in helping you to get from point A to point B. You have seen a connection between exercise and health. You know, more regular exercise and more likely that you're going to experience good health and less ill health. So you've seen the connection there through reason, but ultimately what motivates your action is the avoidance of ill health and the seeking after health. And, you know, what is that avoidance of ill health about? It's about no likey ill health. It's that simple. And so Hume here is building an account of motivation that's important to his position. We will, you know, argue against this in a later lecture. Particularly, I think Immanuel Kant, you know, is going to take issue with Hume on this issue of motivation. But this is crucial to Hume's position. He thinks that we are mistaken in imagining that reasoning and thinking ever are the sole source of action and conduct. We do not take action because of thinking alone. Thinking is often involved, but ultimately the motivation is sentiment. Okay, so we said before that moral judgments are connected to actions. If you really believe killing is wrong, then you have a strong motivation to not kill, right? And now we've argued that reason alone doesn't get you to action, that sentiments alone motivate actions. And so this completes the argument. We have a connection, a strong connection between moral judgment and action, a strong connection between sentiments and action, and we have a disconnect between reason by itself and action, which suggests that moral judgments and reason are somehow not intimately related, but moral judgments and sentiments are more intimately related, i.e. the position Hume's trying to develop, that that sentiments are the source of our moral judgments. Okay, again, a little bit of an indirect argument going through motivation. Let me help just a little bit more here with this idea that reason alone doesn't motivate us to act. Here's an example that I've created to try to, you know, charitably help Hume's argument here. Imagine that we construct a robot and we give it a really, really complex and powerful computer brain. Now, in some sense, this robot has a capacity for thought in the Humean sense of what thinking or reasoning is about. The robot's computer brain can process information, can perform sort of logical inferences and deductions, maybe better and faster than any of us. Maybe this robot could beat 50 of us at the same time in a game of chess, because this robot can process the information and the logical inferences and deductions, i.e. in the Humean sense, it can think, it can reason, maybe even better than we can. But once we finish constructing this robot, we turn it on, and what does it do? And my students often, maybe say, well, it plays chess. And, some of them get the point here. Well, it doesn't do anything. And well, why not? It can think. Why doesn't it do anything? Well, we haven't given it any commands. Okay, well, let's explore this. What we've said is that the robot has a capacity for logic. It has a capacity for reasoning, but yet it won't take any action until we give it a command. Why? What's it missing, right? It's missing sentiment. It doesn't have, in and of itself, a capacity for likey and no likey. It doesn't have a capacity, to use Hume's fancier language, it doesn't have sentiments of approbation and sentiments of disapprobation, right? And so because it lacks a sentience, I would say, and it lacks likey and no likey for itself, it has to wait for a creature that has that capability, i.e. us, to give it commands, right? Go now, use your thinking ability to figure out how to clean my house, right? Okay, that's something I would likey, so it's a command maybe I give to the robot. Okay, that's me trying to help Hume out in developing his case that reason by itself doesn't generate action. And if moral judgments do, and sentiments do, that kind of completes this first argument. Reason by itself must not be intimately connected or directly connected to the source of our moral judgments and to the origins of morality amongst human beings. Okay, so now let's turn our attention to the second and more famous, and I would argue even more persuasive argument for many people that comes out of his inquiry concerning principles of morals. And this is a very brief passage, but I'm going to, again, try to flesh it out a little bit and develop a version of it I've developed over the years to help Hume out. Hume says something like this, I'll paraphrase, I don't have the quote right in front of me. He says, take something that is sort of obviously immoral, like willful murder. Okay, this is the famous murder example or murder case. And Hume's going to argue based on this famous murder case that reason by itself, reason alone, cannot decide right from wrong. As he puts it, it's something more like this. He says, reason alone cannot decide moral matters, moral debates, moral dilemmas, moral questions, right? And to spell that out a little bit, reason alone cannot decide right from wrong, morally speaking. And to develop that case, he says, imagine a scenario of something that's sort of obviously immoral, like willful murder. Now, look at this case as closely as you want, ascertain all the facts of the matter, and then think logically about all the facts and try to see if you ever come up with the wrongness of the murder. And he says, you won't. You never will, as long as you stay with just your thoughts about the facts and the relationships between the facts and the relationships between the ideas involved. You won't until you turn your attention into your own breast, into your own sentiments of approbation and disapprobation. And there you will find that even though you are not the one lying on the floor dead, you are unhappy about this situation at some level. You have a no likey. You have a sentiment of disapprobation. That is going to tell us that something wrong has happened here. Okay, let me develop this in the way that I commonly develop it in my ground classes and lectures there. Imagine a scenario, and forgive me ahead of time that I often use this as a bit of comic relief, but yet it's a kind of a dark example, so forgive me for that. I don't mean to sound insensitive, but imagine a scenario in which a bunch of students and I are standing outside of our classroom, and we think the door is locked. And we think we're waiting for it to be open, but I check it again and I realize, oh, silly us, it was open the whole time. We're just standing out here. And so we go in, we flip on the lights, and we see two students from the class. Let's say, Bob and who, Jamila. Bob and Jamila well, they're not standing. Okay, so Bob is laying on the floor covered in blood, and Jamila is standing over Bob holding a very large knife and looking at us with kind of a shocked expression when we turn on the lights. Okay, so ask yourself, what's your first reaction to this? If you literally walked into this room, right? A lot of students I ask, well, what's your reaction to this? A lot of students, say, well, I would scream or I would run away. That's very normal reaction, right? Screaming, running away. It's a no likey, right? I mean, if some student said, cool, that would add to the bizarreness of the situation. First of all, we just walked into a room, right, and we found, a dead classmate. So this is already a bizarre situation and a terrible situation. And if somebody said, cool, in my mind, I'm already like trying to process this, like, what's wrong with you? If you just said cool, I mean, are you imagining that this is some theater project that has been moved into our room? And, you find it so convincing that you're saying cool. Like, I'm trying to find a way this makes sense, because cool as a response to this scene makes no sense, right? I'm developing Hume's point here that in some sense, the reaction that would be the typical, normal, healthy human reaction would be to be upset, to the point of screaming, to the point of running away, to the very point of like, oh my God, this is terrible kind of situation. And so maybe what we would do, right, is that we would call, the authorities, right? And, imagine for a moment that it's like some of those TV crime scene investigation TV shows, and a bunch of hot people show up with all the best equipment possible, and they just, interview, they look at everything, from top to bottom, and they're going to generate a report on this. And we'll come back to the report in just a second. Let me develop a couple of sort of variations on this Humean example that I've developed. Imagine that in this moment when we're all still, somebody's calling the authorities, we're all still sort of in shock and just like it's a horrible situation, and somebody has screamed and somebody's run away, and poor Jamila's just standing there with this terrible frozen look on her face, and maybe somebody's getting their act together here and saying, Jamila, give me the knife, put down the knife, step away, from the knife. Okay, so somebody's getting their, sort of getting their wits about them. We might say sort of, getting their head recovering, right? Their capacity for thought. Well, what if in that moment that somebody gets the knife away from Jamila, that we find that one of the students, let's say, John walks to the back of the room and sits down, and we're all just now a little bit confused. And we're like, John, what are you doing? And John says, are we having class or what? Well, here's another one, besides cool, and again, let's flesh this out. Imagine somebody says cool, and we're like, what? Cool? Not cool, man. Bob's really dead, And that student says, oh God, I thought it was a theater project, right? Like, okay, all right, take care of that. But now John's gone and sat down, and we're like, John, what are you doing? He says, well, are we going to have class or what? Okay, that's another very bizarre response to the situation, okay? And in some sense, what's bizarre about it is the complete lack of strong feeling-based reaction to what we've witnessed here, right? You know, and what if we press John? We say, John, what do you mean? No, of course we're not going to have class. Somebody's dead here. This is absolutely a tragedy. You know, what the hell are you doing? And John says, well, it's not me dead and it's not you dead. So are we going to have class or what? You know, the professor's still alive. I'm still alive. Just let me know so I can decide whether I stay. Okay. Again, bizarre, right? Something's not quite right in the psychology of this person who would just sit down in this scene and have no feeling-based reaction. Even with this kind of, and I tried to develop this for you a little bit, lead your thinking a little bit on this. You know, what John's saying is, hey, I'm not dead. Professor's not dead. Are we having class or not? Okay, there's a kind of a logic to that, but there's something really, you know, like we might say kind of sociopathic about that, right? Like your inability, your lack of being upset in this moment is disturbing. And let me help, you know, foreshadow something. Hume has made this claim, right, that in this murder scene, we're never going to figure out the wrongness until we turn our attention into our own, you know, breast, our own chest, and feel the strong sense of this is upsetting. And that's going to be our clue that something bad has happened here. And importantly, right, it's not something bad that's happened to us. It's something bad that's happened to somebody else, but it's still upsetting to us, right? Like that is what Hume will call disinterested sentiment. And it's a kind of an unfortunate phrase. It doesn't translate well to the 21st century because it sounds like feelings that are based on a lack of interest. But what it is it's a not self-interested feeling, right? In this case, we're all upset in the doorway. Something has happened to Bob. He's laying dead on the floor in a pile of blood. It's not us, but we're still upset. Right? Why? Because we have the capacity for what Hume calls disinterested sentiments. Now, let me use a couple of words here that might be more useful in the modern age. Maybe we could talk about sympathy or empathy, which I think psychologists would differentiate here, but I won't go into that level of detail. Let's just talk about maybe empathy or sympathy as a capacity generally to sort of feel something that's happening to somebody else, right? And so the Bob being dead and Jamila standing over Bob with this bloody knife and the blood everywhere, this is upsetting. It's not our nervous system that's been impacted, right? And so John's lack of reaction here is off. Let me give you another, you know, version of off here that, again, I think is going to help us to understand Hume's position, but this is me sort of taking this way beyond how Hume developed it in his inquiry and as his murder scene example in the inquiry concerning principles of morals. Let's imagine that I start weeping and a student kindly pulls me to his shoulder and says, oh, Dr. Swanson, it's okay. I know this is incredibly upsetting. And between my sobs, I start to say, I know, like, where am I going to teach now? Bob bled all over the carpet. And that's where maybe that person pulls me off their shoulder and says, Dr. Swanson, what the hell's wrong with you? This is not about your carpet, right? This is not about your classroom. Bob's dead. Okay, pull yourself together. Now, I want to, again, it's kind of a silly example, but in some sense, look, I had a negative feeling. You guys, the rest of the students had negative feelings, okay? When we looked into our own breasts, we found sentiments of disapprobation. But my feeling is off, right? John's lack of feeling was off. The first response where somebody said, cool, was a positive feeling. That was off. That was a misunderstanding. My feeling is negative, just like yours, but mine's also off. What's off about it? Well, what's off about it is that it's a self-interested sentiment in a moment that so clearly, for typical human psychology, should take us beyond ourselves, right? I'm worried about my classroom and the blood stains. That's totally inappropriate in the context of a person being killed, right? My self-interested sentiments tell me something bad has happened here. But I'm not seeing this as something morally bad. I'm seeing this as something that's just bad because of the way it impacts me. Now, again, this is important because Hume is trying to develop a subjectivist account of ethics, right? Which means he's going to try to explain how moral judgments are tied to feelings and sentiments. But not all feelings and sentiments are equally valid in terms of how we should go about forming our moral judgments. When that first student said cool, and let's just stick with that. Imagine for a second that that student didn't think it was a theater situation. What if that student just hated Bob? And that student says, cool, Bob's dead. Again, totally inappropriate, right? And we might say, look, what? I don't know what problem you have with Bob. And they maybe say, Bob went to a rival high school. Okay, even worse. This just got worse. This wasn't Bob did something horrible to you. You're now literally celebrating Bob's death because Bob went to a rival high school. Totally inappropriate. A feeling-based response, possible for a human to have, but not the appropriate feeling-based response to generate a decent moral judgment in this situation. John's lack of response, sitting down, are we going to have class or what? That also will not generate any moral judgment on the situation because he doesn't have any feelings at all. My negative feeling based upon how my classroom has been disrupted, also not appropriate. And in some sense, right, like this is just obvious to us all. The appropriate base response would be to be upset about this situation, not because of how it impacts us and how it's ruining our day and how we're all going to need therapy after this and that this is going to be very traumatic and it's going to stick with us for the rest of our life. All that's true, but we're upset in this moment because a classmate is dead. Not us, not how it impacts us. That's the sort of realistic sounding, I hope, and appropriate feeling-based response that gives rise to this capacity that Hume is describing to say something wrong has happened here. Now again, let me take this example one step further. Let's imagine that the police or the hot CSI team has come in and they've done everything they could do with digital photography and genetics and hidden cameras, and we finally get the report. Now, again, just to sort of reiterate a very Humean point about this situation, read the report from the police and say, and imagine, ask yourself, are you going to find anything about the wrongness, the moral wrongness, let's say the viciousness or the virtuosity or the moral rightness or moral wrongness of the situation? Are you going to read anything about good or evil in this report? And the answer is no, because we can study empirically the scene as much as possible, and what we will find are the facts and not the values. And that's a modern crisis kind of point, right? But what if we read the facts and we see, for example, that the knife did not come from Jamila's house, it came from Bob's house. And Jamila, as far as the evidence suggests, has never been to Bob's house. Secondly, witnesses report that they saw Bob earlier in the day with a knife like this, and other witnesses reported Bob harassing Jamila on other days about helping him write his ethics paper. And he said something about, you're going to help me write the ethics paper because Jamila's a really good student, or else. Okay, now let us reason for a moment together. Let us think for a moment together about the facts. The knife is Bob's. It came from Bob's house. When we walked in, Jamila was holding it, covered in blood, standing over Bob. Okay, we definitely all jumped to an assumption here that Jamila didn't own that knife. She didn't have access to the knife. Witnesses tell us that not only is it from Bob's house, evidence tells us from Bob's house, witnesses tell us Bob had that knife earlier in the day in his possession. And also now we have the reports of Bob having threatened Jamila with violence. Okay, let's reason, right? Okay, you see where I'm going. I'm spending too much time on this. We're going to use reason here. And reason's going to help us to explore the relationships between certain ideas and draw a logical conclusion. Okay, now again, let's just imagine this is like a TV show, and we find some footage, based on some camera in the room at the last, minute of the show, and sure enough, here comes the denouement, and it all unravels. We see or we hear somehow on tape that that Bob has caught Jamila alone in the classroom before anybody else is there. He pulls out this knife. He says, "You're going to help me on the ethics paper or else." Maybe he's just trying to scare her, but he leans in, and Jamila's not only a good student, but she's been studying the more subtle martial arts for years. And as Bob leans into her, she flips the blade around and uses Bob's own lean against him, and the blade slips in. Now she, I think we have every reason to believe, was afraid for her life in that moment, and she has reacted with her martial arts training in this moment, and effectively she's killed Bob. Okay, now that's what we thought, but has she murdered Bob? Has Jamila done something morally condemnable? Do you feel differently about the situation than you did when you first opened the door and all you saw was Bob's body on the ground and Jamila standing over him with that look, right, of shock, with holding the knife, with the knife to blood? Well, I hope the answer is yes. Obviously, we feel very differently about the situation now because we have very good reason to believe that Bob was, in some sense, violently threatening Jamila, and that Jamila, while it does seem like she killed Bob, she didn't like premeditate this. This wasn't some act of passion on her part for some malice against Bob. Sure, she had every reason to fear Bob and be mad with him, but in this moment, it would appear that she acted out of self-defense, which is a totally different kind of action in terms of its moral quality. And so, well, how do we know that? Well, I feel totally different now. I know, likey, what Bob's been up to. I feel sorry for what Jamila's been experiencing of late. In fact, I feel sorry for what Jamila's experiencing right in this moment as she's trying to come to grips with the fact that she's just killed Bob. I have every reason to believe she didn't want to kill Bob, right? She's not a murderer. She's somebody who had to do something terrible in her own self-defense. Okay, now, I've really made a meal of this example by fleshing it out, but I think it allows us to see a number of important points that make the Humean claim about moral judgment and Humean subjectivism sound, I hope, plausible and even persuasive in a way that is reasonable. Okay, one, reason alone could not have decided what happened. And the argument for that was, look at the facts and think about the facts all day long. That's important, it turns out, but it doesn't tell you what was right or wrong until you add your feeling-based reactions to that. The reasoning gives you the facts. Now, it turns out that while reason alone cannot decide the moral matter and cannot decide what was right and what was wrong about the situation, getting the facts straight via thinking and reasoning really did matter. Keep in mind the lack of feeling-based response that John had, "Are we going to have class or what?" The cool response of the student from the rival high school, "Oh no, this is terrible," response, because it hurt my classroom, right? Like that. Those were all the human responses, unfortunately. Do humans have feelings based on rivalry and age-old sort of differences between groups? That breed hatred over time and lead people to kill people? Yeah, they do. Okay, that's real. But in this case, what should be obvious to us human beings is that the right response for generating an understanding of what went wrong morally here is the negative feeling we have about what Bob was doing to Jamila, and the compassion we would feel for Jamila, the good student, the martial arts practitioner, and the one that had to kill somebody in self-defense today. Are we all going to be traumatized by this? Absolutely we are. And we're going to probably need some counseling to help us process this. And that's almost the point. We didn't get hurt, right? But we have a capacity to feel. Disinterested sentiments, or maybe we could call it again, empathy, allows us to feel the pleasures and in this case, the pains of others in ways that are powerful and meaningful. And Hume's going to say, and if we didn't have that capacity, the idea of moral right and wrong wouldn't exist. And not only would morality not exist, we would not have a way to find generally moral agreement. That's another important point to bring out here, right? Is that Hume says, if we get the facts straight and we use our capacity for disinterested sentiments or empathy, then more often than not, we could agree on our moral judgments. And he goes on to more specifically claim that most cases of moral disagreement are actually by decent people with capacities for disinterested sentiments who just understand the facts of the situation differently. If let's say Marcus, somehow didn't get the report that came from the police and was still looking at the situation through that original interpretation that Jamila looks like, obviously Jamila killed Bob, Jamila must have murdered him. Well, Marcus has got this negative feeling towards Jamila in this moment, and I no longer do, okay? And are we both equally right? No. In the sense, I am in a better position to make a reasonable moral judgment here based on my feelings, in part because I have the facts straight. Most moral disagreements, Hume claims, are disagreements really about the facts. If we could understand reality the same way in terms of what we, imagine the facts to be, what are the logical implications of those facts, we would more often than not generally agree. Okay, so based on this, I want to just sort of draw out a couple of final thoughts here. Values in general are not found in reality outside of the human capacity to feel. Values, even values like beautiful and ugly or good tasting or bad tasting, right, is in the feeling-based response of creatures like us. And particularly humans are capable of conceptualizing our human-based response, right? And so, in some sense, Hume is claiming that morality is sort of a conceptual organization of one part of our human feeling ability, namely kind of a way of systematically conceptualizing our capacity to feel the world through disinterested sentiments. And so while values generally don't exist outside of creatures that can feel sort of I likey and no likey, not all values, right, not all feelings give rise to what we should think of as moral value judgments, right? And remember the example, when I said, oh no, this is bad because my room has been ruined. I had a negative feeling, but my feeling was inappropriate in terms of applying it to an understanding of the rightness or wrongness of the situation because my feeling was self-interested. The student that said, yay, hooray, Bob's dead because he went to a rival high school, right? That kind of feud-based feeling that is also self-interested, right? And so we have a way to determine moral judgments that are more appropriate than others if they are based in disinterested sentiments rather than in self-interested sentiments. This is also, by the way, why you wouldn't want to ask somebody who's got a severe kind of sociopathy, right, an inability to feel the pain or pleasure of others, why you wouldn't want to ask them about morality, right? And why we're often a little bit frightened of, a lot frightened sometimes of sociopaths. And I hesitate only to say that sociopaths are usually very intelligent, and they can learn to behave in such a way that is consistent with societal norms. But it doesn't seem to ever be for some reason like that Hume is drawing out here. It's never because of empathy. It's never because it really troubles them to see the pain of the other. It's because they've learned that they better avoid those kind of things if they want to be able to continue to act with freedom in society. And so, you know, again, to make my point there, you know, there are more appropriate and less appropriate responses, feeling-based responses. And so now we have a way to avoid relativism, right? Humean subjectivism is not relativistic. And so he's got this famous line, I believe it's actually from his earlier work, A Treatise of Human Nature, where he says, reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions. Let's think about that just for a second, make sure we're understanding the Humean perspective here. Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions. Now, in some sense, when he says reason is the slave of the passions, he's just again reiterating his in some sense, psychology of motivation, his theory of human motivation, that it's always passional, it's always based in sentiments, to use the word we've used more commonly in this lecture. But remember, he adds not only reason is, but this other sort of seemingly unnecessary addition. If reason already is the slave of the passions, why do we need to say reason ought only to be? Well, because this is a moral claim now. He's going beyond the descriptive psychological claim to make an ethical claim here. Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions is not only making the descriptive claim that we are determined by sentiments, but he's saying reason should be determined by sentiments. And to be clear, you know, ask yourself this question, see how well you're getting this. What sentiments must he be talking about there if he claims that reason ought, should, right, in some sense, it's only right that reason is the slave of the sentiments or the passions? What kind of sentiments must we be talking about? And hopefully what you're going to answer there is disinterested sentiments. Because if reason serves the sentiments, let's say, of that one student who had the high school rivalry with Bob, well, that's going to be frightening, because that person's going to use their capacity to think and to reason and to be logical in order to, you know, serve some very self-interested, sort of tribalistic, feud-oriented feelings. Well, you know, keep an eye on that person, because it's liable to make them do something wrong. But if, on the other hand, reason is a slave of the disinterested sentiments, if thinking and logic is always reined in by our capacity to not like the pain of each other and to enjoy the joy of each other, then, you know, we're going to be in good shape, right? I want to also, you know, just draw attention to a kind of a contrast with Thomas Hobbes, who wrote Leviathan about a century prior to Hume doing this work. And in some ways, Hume is very much, I think, responding to this sort of this set of claims that come out of social contract thinking and Hobbes, that, you know, two things. One, that that reason is the source of morality. Originally, you know, Hume says, no. There wouldn't be morality if there weren't disinterested sentiments. Reason alone can't account for it. And secondly, in terms of human motivation, you might recall that that Hobbes and social contractarians in general seem to be committed to the idea that we act out of self-interest. And Hume has what we might call a twin pillars account of motivation, where he thinks that, yes, absolutely, self-interest is a part of what motivates us in much of what we do, but we also naturally have a capacity to be motivated by disinterested sentiments, or motivated by our capacity for empathy. And he actually has a couple of beautiful quotes I want to finish up with here from his inquiry concerning the principles of morals, in the, I think in the 1751 version, and then later the 1777 version. Hume's actually a very beautiful writer at times, so I like to share some of this language. He says, it cannot be disputed that there is some benevolence, however small, infused into our bosom, some spark of friendship for humankind, some particle of the dove kneaded into our frame, along with the elements of the wolf and the serpent. Okay, it's a beautiful sort of rendering in poetic language of this twin pillars idea, right? It cannot be, says it cannot be disputed. It's just sort of present to us to feel that there's some benevolence, some kindness, however small, it's there. It is built into our capacity to feel we have a spark of friendship for humankind, right? And I actually would, plant a seed here and say, I think it actually goes beyond that, right? And this is in some sense a way to respond to the limitations of social contract theory. What's wrong with animal torture? Well, the animal torturer, right, like the non-human animal torturer, or the human torturer for that matter, is just sick. That there's something off in terms of their psychology, because what's natural to us, and again, it's not everybody, but what is normal and what is crucial that it be normal is that we have some capacity to care for strangers. In fact, we have some capacity to care for creatures that aren't even in our species. And then that beautiful language, some particle of the dove kneaded into our frame, right? Along with the elements of the wolf and serpent. He's not a fool. He's not saying we don't have that capacity for rivalry and feuds that lead to hatred and killing. He's not saying we don't have selfishness. We don't have all of these other sort of darker emotions. All that's very real, right? Here's one last quote I want to share with you. He argues, sort of pleads with us. He says, where is the difficulty in conceiving that from the original frame of our temper, from the original sort of making of our human personalities and characters, naturally speaking, from the original frame of our temper, where is the difficulty in conceiving that from the original frame of our temper, we may feel a desire for another's happiness or good, which by means of affection, sentiment, becomes our own good and is afterwards pursued from the combined motives of benevolence and self-enjoyments? Who sees not that vengeance from force alone of passion, this is that tribalism, that rivalry, vengeance from force alone of passion may be so eagerly pursued as to make us knowingly neglect every consideration of ease, interest, or safety, and like some vindictive animal, infuse our very souls into the wounds we give an enemy, right? Who sees not, who refuses to see that vengeance, right? Like that tribalism that leads to this hatred over generations where we're killing each other, maybe because we've got different words for God or something like that, or different words and practices in terms of our worship, and we end up killing one another. Who denies that that's possible, right? And what a malignant philosophy it must be, he goes on, that will not allow to humanity and friendship the same privileges which are indisputably granted to the darker passions of enmity and resentment, of hatred and resentment. Right? Like everybody is willing to admit that humans are these creatures that can do terrible things to one another through things like vengeance and tribalism and all kinds of self-interested feelings and crazy socially constructed, enculturated based hatreds. Well, can't we also admit, Hume says, that we, like a Harriet Tubman, can ignore the well-being and flourishing of our own lives just to see the suffering of a stranger stop? Doesn't that happen too? You know, it's back to the original point I made that where Hume is just disagreeing with social contract. He just doesn't think that we can account for this beautiful side of what we see in ourselves. He's not denying foolishly the darker side of what humanity is capable of. It's frightening, and sometimes it threatens to seemingly overwhelm the world. But at the same time, we often pull together in ways that are beautiful and inspirational. And can't we give kind of equal footing? Who's going to say we're only ever motivated by self-interest? Why can't we just admit that, yes, we're often motivated by self-interest, but at times we are motivated by the most noble capacities we have to feel the joys of other beings and to feel the pains of other beings. And through this capacity for feeling, we make their joys our own and we make their pain our own. And this, right, is our humanity. And this is the grounds for morality. And if we got the facts straight and we cultivated this part of ourselves and paid more attention to this part of ourselves and cultivated that in our children, instead of always teaching our children to be individuals that compete with other individuals, if we, and we often do, reward our children, right, for being compassionate and empathic creatures, then we would see a world where morality would increase and that the tide of goodness might push back the unfortunate floods of hatred and killing and what we would call wrongdoing in the world. Okay, so that is my account of David Hume's version of ethical subjectivism. I hope you all will nurture that part in yourselves that will allow you to feel the pleasures and pains of other people around you and other creatures around you. And I do think that there's something very persuasive in this, that if we all cultivated that, if we all nurtured that in ourselves and in our young people, that the world could be not a perfect place, but a better place. I wish you well. I hope we all live to see it.